He didn't start with a cartel. He didn't have a connect in Colombia. He started broke, moving crack on the streets of Los Angeles, and somehow turned it into millions. But years later, the truth hit harder than any prison sentence ever could. The coke flooding his operation wasn't coming from the streets. It was coming from the government. Behind the money, the power, and the rise of Freeway Rick Ross was a pipeline so dirty it shook the country. A supply chain that traced back to the CIA, secret wars, and a deal nobody was supposed to survive knowing. This is how a street hustler built an empire and discovered his supplier was the CIA itself. Freeway Rick Ross, born Ricky Donald Ross on January 26, 1960, grew up in Los Angeles. The name Freeway wasn't random. It came from properties he owned along Interstate 110, the Harbor Freeway. Ross grew up without a father. His parents split when he was just 4 months old, leaving his deeply religious mother to raise him alone. She ran a tight house and believed in hard discipline. Ross later said she uses a telephone cord to whip him, something he admitted would be called child abuse today. He said it left welts on his butt. Life was rough financially. From a young age, Ross was already focused on money. He cut neighbors' grass, sold lemonade, and pumped gas. But alongside the hustle came trouble. He shoplifted, ran errands for pimps in his neighborhood, and fought classmates at school. With no father figure, the streets stepped in. Older guys he saw as powerful and respected became his examples. Figures like Tookie Williams, Raymond Washington, and Cartoon, early leaders of the Crips, were the people young Ross looked up to. By 6th grade, he crossed a bigger line, stealing watches from a thrifty store with friends. The police never caught him, but his mother found one of the watches, and the punishment at home was severe. Ross was drawn to the Crips gang because of what they represented at the time: unity, structure, reputation, and belonging. This was before the deaths and before substances twisted gangs into something darker. Back then, it was mostly about hanging out, getting into fistfights, and playing football. And right when Ross was about to get deep in that street life, something crazy happened. He caught feelings for tennis. The sport literally pulled him out of South Central and dropped him in a whole different universe. Down the line, though, young Ross found out he could really ball with that racket. In high school, he was so good that a recruiter from Cal State Long Beach was checking for him. But his dreams of getting that tennis scholarship got crushed when coaches found out he still couldn't read. Even though Ross almost failed so many times in school because he couldn't read, his high school coach made sure he stayed in school. But Ross ended up dropping out before he graduated, and a whole different type of education was about to start. At 19, Ross got put on to sell coke through Mike, this older dude who was playing college football at San Jose State. At the time, Ross was dead broke and feeling defeated, just sitting on his mom's porch with literally nothing when one phone call changed his whole life. Mike threw some coke on the table, but it wasn't that white powder Ross had seen in movies like Superfly. Nah, this was yellow and fresh off the brick, straight raw, no cut, nothing. Ross didn't even know what he was looking at, but he was desperate. So he grabbed $50 worth and started asking big hustlers around the liquor store what it was. That's how he met Martin, this pimp who took Ross to his house and showed him something he had never seen before, cooking powder coke into what they called Ready Rock back then. The government named it crack later. Martin smoked up the whole batch himself, said he would pay Ross back that 50. He never did, but he did put Ross onto his first real customer, this guy called Big Mouse, who came through with $100. That one deal right there, that's when Ross started his come up in the coke game. Martin and Big Mouse became his first customers, and that moment set the whole thing in motion. Ross's hustle blew up quick. He went from moving $50 worth for Mike to pulling in $300 a day, but that wasn't enough. He didn't want to be nobody's worker bee forever. Ross wanted to run his own show, so he linked up with Ollie, who just got out of jail on a burglary charge. They needed $300 to buy their first 8-track, supposedly 3.5 grams. But real talk, it was probably way less actual coke mixed with a bunch of cutting agents. To get that money, they stole a car from their old junior high school and chopped it up for parts. They took that money, bought their first pack, and just kept flipping it over and over, putting every dollar right back in to buy more. During this time, Ross enrolled at Venice Gilson Trade School and met this teacher, Mr. Fisher. But he only stuck around Gilson for a month before he switched to Los Angeles Trade Technical College, where he played tennis for a year or two. While folks in the hood were starting to get strung out on coke, Ross got strung out on the money instead. He tried using coke once, but it didn't even get him high, which probably saved his life business-wise. Plus, Ross's whole athlete mentality kept him away from using coke, even after he started selling them. He lived by this code that an athlete's supposed to run, work out, and stay in peak shape, not be out here getting high. That mindset was going to save him in the long run. While mad dealers ended up becoming fiends of their own supply, Ross stayed clean, treating his body like he was still a pro athlete. A major change happened when Ross ran back into his old teacher, Mr. Fisher, who was suddenly getting money. Fisher told him he made $250,000 selling coke and had the right connects. That number was so big, Ross couldn't even wrap his head around it at first. Fisher started giving Ross work to move. Ross took whatever profit he made and flipped it right back into more coke, building up his little operation. Eventually, Ross was asking for way more product than the teacher wanted to deal with, so he had to go find a connect. Fisher plugged Ross in with some suppliers, a connection that was going to change everything later on. The teacher put Ross onto his supplier, Ivan Arguelles, who said he would keep Ross fed. Arguelles could supply way bigger amounts for a better price, and Ross went from moving grams to moving whole ounces real quick. But then Fisher started getting too high on his own supply, and it was messing up the business. He kept demanding more product, only worked when he felt like it, and became straight unreliable. When his behavior got too wild, Ross and the Nicaraguan connects cut him out completely, giving Ross direct access to the plug. About 8 months after Arguelles started supplying Ross, he got shot in the spine and ended up in the hospital for months, which knocked him out the game. His brother-in-law, Henry Corrales, took over the business, but he wasn't really about that life, and he failed to have any connects of his own to suppliers. Ross's connection to the Nicaraguan suppliers, Arguelles and Corrales, eventually led him to Blandon, first through Corrales. Even though Blandon didn't know Ross personally, he was impressed by how much coke Ross was moving. Blandon offered to supply Corrales to sell to Ross, splitting the profit 50-50. Eventually, though, Corrales got tired of the game and stepped away. In a boss move that showed how confident Ross was getting as a businessman, he paid Corrales $60,000 just for the chance to meet Blandon face-to-face. And Blandon paid $60 to meet him too. Corrales pocketed $120,000 and bounced, while Ross got something way more valuable: direct access to basically unlimited supply. Ross and Blandon started kicking it beyond just business. They would have meetings at Blandon's crib, and Ross felt like they were building a real friendship. This was completely different from how he dealt with other Nicaraguans. Those were always straight business, quick cash for product exchanges, then everybody went their separate ways. Blandon was different though, mixing business with a personal connection. What Ross didn't know was that Blandon was tied up in some covert government operation involving the CIA and all that. Coke money was getting funneled to fund anti-communist forces in Nicaragua, getting around U.S. congressional restrictions. Ross became a major distribution channel in this whole pipeline, completely clueless about the bigger political game being played above him. He wouldn't find out about the scandal, later called the Iran-Contra affair, until after he was already locked up. At the peak, Ross's operation was on another level. During the last 2 years he was in the game, he was moving up to 100 kilos of coke a day. That's wild amounts of product flooding the streets, going through mad different hands and routes. When you're talking hundreds of kilos daily, the reach and damage of that operation was crazy, way beyond anything Ross imagined when he first got in. Ricky and Blandon also became gun dealers, selling Uzis, Alaska, 47, and Colt AR-15 that became the signature weapons in them bloody Crip versus Bloods gang wars and drive-bys in the 80s. Blandon even tried to sell Ross a grenade launcher one time. Through his connect to Blandon, he met Blandon's supplier, Norwin Maynesis Cantare-Ro, who was bragging about moving 500 kilos a month, worth about $10 million. Ross was able to buy Nicaraguan coke for way cheaper than normal. Ross started selling coke at $10,000 per kilo, which was well below what everybody else was charging, while also supplying both the Bloods and Crips gangs. By 1982, Ross got the nickname Freeway Ricky, and he was moving up to $3 million worth of coke per day, buying 1,000 pounds a week. Ross was a millionaire by 23, mostly thanks to Blandon, who wasn't just his supplier, but also his mentor. But real talk, his come up was also definitely helped by the 1980s crack epidemic, which tore through LA and the whole country. Ross was moving smart with his money at first. He put most of his profits into houses and businesses because he didn't want his mom catching on to what he was really out here doing if he started buying a bunch of flashy stuff. He even invested in Anita Baker's first album. It was only a matter of time before Ross's operation blew up to dozens of other cities across the country, getting him even more money. Ross bought mad real estate all over Southern California, but he wasn't moving selfish with it. He helped his moms renovate her church, put money behind a semi-pro basketball team, and started up a youth tennis program in the same broke neighborhood he came up in. While his workers was out here pushing Ferraris, Rolls Royces, draped in heavy gold chains, living that flashy lifestyle, Ross stayed looking regular on purpose. He wore simple fits and pushed regular cars, knowing that being too visible was asking for problems. He wasn't trying to look like no coke dealer or flex his wealth with jewelry and luxury cars. His humble drip was so convincing that folks would think he was one of his own workers, or straight up a crackhead. First time he hit county jail, he heard guys in the holding tank talking about him. One dude was claiming to be his cousin, going on about how he came to his house and saw a mountain of coke on the table. Ross ain't never seen that man in his life. This whole move was strategic, though. Ross knew that showing off made your workers jealous and brought the feds to your door. By staying low, he moved around in broad daylight while his flashy homies caught all the heat. At his peak, Ross was running with the roughly 25 to 30 direct lieutenants under him. His whole leadership style was surprisingly down to earth and practical. He believed staying humble was everything and always tried to see things from other people's point of view, knowing that most folks care way more about their own situation than anybody else's. He also understood basic human needs, food, shelter, and clothes, and knew that keeping people stable kept them loyal. Still, he kept it real with himself, knowing that no matter how good you treat folks, some are always going to move shady. It got to a point, Ross got labeled the biggest pusher of crack in the United States, a title he always pushed back on when people tried to say he invented crack or was the only one responsible for the epidemic. Crack was already out there in the form of freebasing, and at first he was paying other people to cook up the coke for him before learning the method from the guys he paid to do it, so he said. What separated Ross from everybody else wasn't that he created something new, it was the sheer scale and access he provided. He basically democratized the whole distribution game by giving away coke, sometimes whole kilos broken down into ounces, to anybody who said they wanted to hustle. Most of them failed miserably. A lot of them ended up smoking the product themselves or just blew the opportunity completely. But a small percentage actually made it work, and those few people generated enough profit to cover all the losses from everybody else who fumbled. Several of the people he put on this way eventually became millionaires themselves, proving the whole model worked from a straight business perspective, but tragedy was waiting right around the corner. Freeway Rick Ross first got investigated by the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department back in 1985, but they couldn't make nothing stick on him. So 2 years later, the LA Sheriff's Department linked up with LAPD to form the Freeway Ricky Task Force. Ross's downfall started with the same law enforcement that was supposed to stop him. The first time the police ran up on him, they didn't just arrest him straight up. Nah, they tried to set him up. Officers claimed they recovered 2 kilos of coke connected to him, but they planted the coke themselves to justify the arrest. They called this move flanking. Ross got locked up based on that whole frame job. The crazy part? Those same crooked sheriff's deputies ended up being key to his legal defense later on. After they got indicted for civil rights violations, money laundering, and planting coke, federal prosecutors came to Ross. In exchange for cutting his sentence down, he agreed to snitch on them. These deputies had been wilding out, torturing suspects, planting evidence, beating people with flashlights and batons, threatening folks who were handcuffed and laying face down. The damage wasn't just some abstract concept either. Ross had physical scars from those encounters and ended up winning a civil lawsuit against the deputies, getting paid for what they did to him. He only served 5 years jail time. Still, the bigger federal case wasn't going anywhere. The real snake move came from Ross's own people, though. His next door neighbor and several younger dudes who came up under him decided to cooperate with the feds. In this new federal reality, with mandatory minimums, strict sentencing guidelines, and judges having no wiggle room, loyalty went out the window quick. Self-preservation replaced loyalty, and snitching became the smartest move for guys facing decades locked up. Prosecutors later calculated that between 1982 and 1989, Ross had moved 3 tons of coke, pulling in gross earnings of $900 million. He pleaded guilty to substance trafficking charges and caught a 10-year bid in prison. He started doing his time in 1990, but it got cut short way earlier than expected, all because of the massive corruption in the same sheriff's office that had been on his head so hard. A federal investigation exposed that authorities in the sheriff's office weren't just planting evidence, they were also stealing coke money and straight up brutalizing suspects. Ross got offered a chance to testify for the government in exchange for doing less time, and he took the deal. Because of that, he walked out less than 5 years into his original sentence. That's when Ross started getting media attention, and it seemed like a lot of people were rooting for him to turn his life around. Even while he was on probation, he moved more like a Robin Hood type dude. You never heard about him getting high or drinking or putting hands on women or selling dope to kids. Ross really had a solid reputation for helping people out and giving money back to the community. But Freeway Rick Ross wasn't going to stay free for long. The past wasn't done with him yet. Danilo Blandon, his old supplier and longtime connect, hit him up with one last proposition, an offer that would drag Ross back into a world he was already trying to walk away from. Blandon told Ross that the Colombians were on his back and he desperately needed money, so Ross agreed to help him out. Blandon didn't actually want Ross to handle a deal himself, though. What he wanted was an introduction, somebody Ross could plug him in with who would do business. By this point, Danilo Blandon wasn't just a trafficker anymore. He was working as a snitch for the DEA, supposedly getting paid around $180,000 to help set up other big dealers. Ross was out of prison and trying to live legit, but the pull of old connections was hard to shake. He made the introduction. What went down next was straight up a setup. Law enforcement everywhere, helicopters circling overhead, unmarked cars pulling up from every direction, officers flooding out in perfect coordination. The whole operation had been planned down to the last detail. This time, there was no room to negotiate or wiggle out. Ross had walked straight into a federal sting, set up by somebody he once thought was his man. The sentence was crushing. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Blandon had delivered him clean and complete into federal custody, destroying any illusion Ross might have had that loyalty still meant something in that world. Not long after he started his life sentence, Ross got a visitor, investigative journalist Gary Webb. That's when Ross finally learned about Blandon's connection to the Contras, a group of rebels who had been trying to overthrow the socialist government of Nicaragua back in the 1980s. The way Webb broke it down, Blandon had been selling coke to finance the Contras' weapons. Webb, who would later drop the expose Dark Alliance, claimed that the CIA was purposely funding the Contras, knowing damn well that these rebels were using crack sales in LA to bankroll their attempted coup. Ross, who didn't know much about Blandon's background, was shook when he heard he might have been a pawn this whole time. This allegation also might have explained why Ross was able to move how he moved for as long as he did without getting touched. While everything seemed hopeless for Ross, he made the most of his time in the prison library and taught himself to read at 28 years old. While reading, he caught a technicality in his case that would let him do less time. He also learned that his prior convictions in Texas and Ohio came from the same federal crime, so they should have counted as 1 strike instead of 2. That would mean he was on his 2nd strike rather than his 3rd, and his sentence would have to get knocked down. His lawyer was skeptical, but it turned out Ross was right. His sentence got reduced to 20 years, and he ended up only doing 14. Ross officially got out in 2009, and he's still walking free today. Ross read over 300 books in prison, plus magazines and newspapers. When people see what's happening with him right now, they might say he's lucky. But nah, he studied and planned. He didn't necessarily know he'd end up in the cannabis industry, though. He was locked up in Texas and didn't even know weed was legal anywhere. It was only when he came home that he found out people could legally smoke weed and legally sell weed. The first time he went to a cannabis cup in San Bernardino, he saw people with big jars of weed, straight up trash bags full of weed. Since his release in 2009, Freeway Rick Ross has reinvented himself as an author, actor, prison reform activist, and legal cannabis entrepreneur. On June 18, 2010, Ross sued rapper Rick Ross for jacking his name, filing a copyright infringement lawsuit against Ross in Los Angeles County Superior Court. Jay-Z even got called to testify in the lawsuit since he was president of Def Jam when Ross got signed to the label. Ross was going after $10 million in compensation in the lawsuit. After the lawsuit got dismissed on the album Teflon Don by rapper Rick Ross dropped as scheduled on July 20, 2010. A federal judge tossed his case, saying it should be refiled in California state court because it fell under California state law. Ross refiled the case with the state of California while appealing his federal case. A federal appeals court upheld the dismissal in 2012. The state case got filed in California. Ross refiled in LA Superior Court with publicity rights claims. However, the case got dismissed by a judge in the LA Superior Court. The California state case got updated with a motion in Freeway Rick Ross's favor regarding Warner Brothers Records and their use of the name and image Rick Ross. A trial was set for August 27, 2013 in Freeway Rick Ross versus Rick Ross and Warner Music Group. The California trial court ruled in favor of the rapper Rick Ross, letting him keep the name. A state appeals court upheld the ruling on First Amendment grounds. Still, Freeway Rick Ross found success dropping his book, Freeway Rick Ross, the untold autobiography, and working on documentaries like Freeway, Crack in the System. Journalist and author Kathy Scott co-wrote Ross's autobiography with him. The memoir was released at a book launch with author Scott at the ESO One bookstore in Los Angeles to a standing room only crowd. The book is fascinating for its raw, inside look at his career on the streets of South Central, which started for Ross with car theft and quickly shifted to coke and the big time. The memoir got nominated for Forward Review's IndieFab Best Book of the Year Award 2014 in the True Crime category. Winners were announced, with the book named as a Forward Review's 2014 IndieFab Book of the Year Award finalist, True Crime. He's also diversified his hustle as an entrepreneur by distributing a variety of products, including legal cannabis. In January 2022, it got reported that Ross had established a boxing management company, Team Freeway Boxing, with 4 professional boxers under contract. Ross is also acting in an advisory role for light welterweight contender Anthony Peterson. In a June 2024 interview on the Joe Rogan Experience, Ross stated he owns a marijuana dispensary. Though Ross might have once felt that selling crack coke was his only path to success, and it might have been difficult to start over again without the money he made as a kingpin. All the books he read while locked up clearly gave him that multimillionaire mindset once again.